Black fiancée mocked by Groom's family, unaware who she was, until she canceled the $950 million deal. Nia Carter had built her life on discipline, ambition, and an unshakable belief that hard work could break barriers. At just 27, she had already climbed higher than many of her peers. Raised in the South Side of Chicago, she knew what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers once told her she was bright but distracted, a polite way of saying they didn't see her going far. But Nia carried the quiet determination of someone who had been told no too many times and had decided to build her own yes. By the time she turned 25, she had earned a degree in business administration from Northwestern, then fought her way into Columbia for her MBA. Each step was not just about education, it was a statement. She was more than the assumptions people placed on her, more than the stereotypes whispered behind her back. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Her career brought her to Chicago's glittering downtown, where glass towers reflected the ambitions of those who worked inside them. Among those towers stood Blake & Partners, a financial consultancy firm with a name that carried 3 generations of prestige. It wasn't just a business, it was a family empire. Landing a role there had been no small achievement. Many fought for a chance to even sit in an interview, but Nia had walked through those doors with quiet confidence and a resume that spoke louder than any introduction. The Blakes were not just wealthy, they were respected. Their influence stretched across social clubs, charity boards, and political fundraisers. When people in Chicago heard the name Blake, they thought of power and legacy. And for nearly 2 years, Nia had been woven into that world, not just as an employee but as the partner of Ethan Blake, the family's only son. Ethan was charming, polished, and the kind of man who carried privilege like a second skin. When they first met, Nia had believed their differences could be bridged. He admired her drive, called her brilliant, and promised he saw her as an equal. Their relationship grew quickly, and soon, she was not just dating Ethan. She was being quietly measured by the family that stood behind him. On the surface, life looked charmed. Nia lived in a sleek apartment overlooking the city, wore tailored suits to client meetings, and traveled to conferences where she was introduced as both a rising star in finance and the fiancée of a Blake. Friends envied her, colleagues respected her, and Ethan seemed devoted. But beneath the polished surface, subtle cracks were forming. The first signs were easy to ignore. A cold smile from Victoria Blake, Ethan's mother, when Nia spoke at a dinner. A dismissive glance from Lauren, Ethan's older sister, when Nia mentioned her background. Small moments that could be brushed aside, excused as nerves or generational differences. But with time, the cracks widened into something more visible, something impossible to overlook. Victoria had been raised in a world where wealth was not just a marker of success but a boundary line of who belonged. To her, Nia represented an intrusion, a disruption to the carefully curated image of their family. Lauren, who had built her social media persona around exclusivity and privilege, saw Nia as competition for the attention she believed only she deserved. And Ethan, though kind in private, often wilted under the weight of his family's expectations. Still, Nia persevered. She told herself love was worth the discomfort, that resilience was part of her story. She had faced harder battles than icy glares. She focused on her work, pouring energy into securing deals worth millions for the firm. Her numbers spoke for themselves, and no one could deny she was an asset. Yet the more successful she became, the more resentment seemed to fester. What no one around the boardroom table knew was that Nia carried more than ambition. She carried knowledge. Years before joining Blake & Partners, she had worked as an independent auditor for a government agency. She understood financial patterns, how money could vanish on paper but not in reality. She could see red flags where others saw nothing but clean numbers. And quietly, almost instinctively, she had begun to notice things within the Blake empire that didn't add up. But this was not the time to act. Not yet. For now, she was preparing for the next stage of her personal life: marriage to Ethan. The engagement had been celebrated in glossy magazines, whispered about in social circles, and photographed at charity galas. Everyone assumed it was the perfect union, the ambitious young woman and the heir to a family empire. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale. Yet behind closed doors, the tension grew sharper. A rehearsal dinner would soon turn into a battlefield of whispered insults and unveiled prejudice. A postponed wedding would unravel more than just romance. And a family that believed they held all the power would learn that the woman they dismissed was holding something far more dangerous than they could imagine. Because Nia Carter wasn't just another guest in their world. She was a storm waiting to break, a reckoning wrapped in elegance. And the Blakes had no idea what was coming. The first true fracture came on the night of the rehearsal dinner. The restaurant was one of Chicago's most exclusive, its chandeliers glittering against polished marble floors, the kind of place where every guest arrived in black cars and every conversation carried weight. For Nia, it was supposed to be a celebration, a step toward a future she had worked so hard to build. Instead, it became the stage where the Blake family's disdain would be put on full display. The evening began politely enough. Guests raised glasses of champagne, staff floated between tables, and the room hummed with low conversations. But as the courses were served, Victoria Blake's voice cut through the air like a blade. With a smile that looked elegant to outsiders but sharp to Nia, she mocked her table manners, suggesting that perhaps some habits couldn't be polished away no matter how much education one claimed. Laughter rippled, soft at first, then louder, and all eyes shifted toward Nia. She could have defended herself, but instead she calmly mentioned her degrees, her hard-won credentials from Northwestern and Columbia. Before the words even settled, Lauren leaned in, her tone dripping with superiority, and sneered that diversity programs opened doors for people like Nia. Around the table, whispers carried, "Gold digger, doesn't belong, not one of us." Ethan sat stiffly, caught between worlds. He raised a hand, tried to smile, and muttered something about not making the night about conflict. But his silence spoke louder than any words could. He chose peace over defense, and Nia felt the sting deeper than any insult. Still, she did not break. She gave a small smile, quiet but deliberate. A smile that unsettled the room. A smile that hinted she knew something they didn't. Days later, the cracks widened further. Ethan told her that the wedding had to be postponed. His reasoning was vague. Family pressure. Too much stress right now. He avoided her eyes as he said it, his voice trembling slightly, and Nia knew the truth. He was not strong enough to stand beside her against his family. The blow that followed was even sharper. Without warning, Nia received notice that her position at Blake and Partners had been terminated. No explanation beyond restructuring. She had brought in million-dollar accounts, secured long-term clients, and carried herself with professional excellence. None of it mattered. Her success had become inconvenient, and the signature at the bottom of her termination papers bore a name she recognized immediately: Victoria Blake. Lauren added her own cruelty soon after. A phone call, dripping with contempt, telling Nia that she would never be part of a family like ours. Each word was calculated to wound, but Nia listened quietly, her silence more powerful than any retort. What the Blakes did not realize was that they were not dealing with a powerless woman scorned. For more than a year, Nia had been building something far more dangerous than resentment. On her laptop sat a growing collection of files, forged contracts, recordings of private meetings, and detailed logs of transactions that did not align. She had noticed anomalies months earlier and, out of habit, followed them like threads on a tangled cloth. What emerged was a web of deceit. Victor Blake, the patriarch, had been siphoning money from client accounts into hidden shells and offshore havens. Nia was not just a fiancée. She was a trained financial investigator, once part of a government agency tasked with rooting out corruption. She had entered the Blake family as an employee, but with every passing month, she had been documenting their empire's darkest secrets. Their attempt to humiliate her only sharpened her resolve. While Victoria tightened her social circle and Lauren flaunted her lifestyle online, Nia pressed forward. She reached out to Elias, Daniel Perez, an investigative journalist known for uncovering corporate scandals, and Ava Mitchell, a corporate attorney with ties to regulators. Together, they created a chain of evidence airtight and impossible to ignore. Every threatening voicemail, every dismissive meeting, every attempt at intimidation. Nia recorded it all. The tension escalated as whispers of an audit began to circulate. Ethan's phone calls grew panicked, begging for a second chance, warning her to stay quiet for her own good. But the tide was turning. By spring, the Illinois Department of Financial Regulation announced a surprise audit of Blake and Partners. Almost simultaneously, Daniel Perez prepared a front-page article that would expose millions in suspicious offshore transfers. The number was staggering: $12 million in retirement funds, hidden away under false names and fraudulent contracts. Inside the Blake mansion, panic took root. Victoria called Nia late at night, her voice tight and trembling, offering settlements and recommendations. Lauren shifted from mockery to hostility, her words laced with both rage and fear. Ethan's messages grew desperate, swinging between apologies and veiled warnings. The family had gone from arrogance to desperation, and Nia watched it unfold with a steady calm. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when she was summoned to their downtown office. The family gathered in a private room, polished wood walls surrounding them like armor. Their offer was pitiful compared to the empire at stake: $40,000 and a letter of recommendation. They believed she could be bought, erased quietly before the storm broke. But Nia had already prepared her storm. She placed her tablet on the table, projected documents across the screen, and revealed their empires rot one file at a time. Fraudulent transfers, altered agreements, a recording of Victor bragging that clients trusted him too much to notice. The room grew colder with each revelation, their polished control slipping into visible fear. And yet, Nia remained calm, because what they didn't know was that her complaint had already been filed. The regulators were already moving. The article was already scheduled to go live. The question wasn't if their downfall would come, it was when. And the Blakes, once so untouchable, were about to learn that underestimating the wrong woman could cost them everything. The boardroom was silent except for the steady hum of the projector. Across the polished table, the Blake family sat frozen, their faces pale against the glow of the evidence flashing before them. Each document Nia revealed stripped away another layer of the empire they had built on lies. Wire transfers showing millions funneled offshore. Client agreements are doctored with subtle changes. Audio clips where Victor Blake's voice dripped with arrogance, boasting about blind trust and hidden accounts. Every second was a knife twisting deeper. Lauren's hand trembled as she tried to text someone under the table. Victoria's posture, once regal, collapsed under the weight of panic. Ethan whispered her name, pleading for her to stop, but Nia's focus was unshakable. She had endured their insults, their cruelty, their attempts to erase her. Now it was their turn to face judgment. Then came the sound that changed everything, the sudden push of doors opening behind her. Dark suits filled the room, badges glinting under the lights. Federal agents, state regulators, and behind them journalists with cameras ready. The room that had once been the Blake family's stronghold was now their cage. Victor rose to his feet, his voice booming with desperation. He called it a misunderstanding, a misrepresentation, an attack fueled by revenge. But his words rang hollow as agents placed folders of their own on the table, matching every detail of the evidence Nia had provided. $12 million in missing retirement funds, fabricated contracts tied directly to his signature, offshore accounts traced to his name. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. The cameras clicked. Reporters shouted questions. Victoria tried to shield her face. Lauren covered hers with shaking hands, and Ethan stared blankly, his perfect future unraveling in real time. The world outside those walls would know the truth within hours. The dynasty they had protected for 3 generations was collapsing before their eyes. But beneath the chaos, another layer of revelation emerged. An agent turned to Nia and addressed her not as a victim, not as a discarded employee, but as something entirely different. She wasn't just Ethan's former fiancée. She wasn't just an ambitious black woman they had tried to humiliate. She was a covert financial crimes investigator, working undercover to dismantle corruption from the inside. For nearly 2 years, she had played her role with precision, gathering evidence while the Blakes mocked her as unworthy. The shock hit harder than any accusation. In that moment, the Blakes realized they had not just underestimated Nia, they had handed her the very access that destroyed them. Their arrogance had been their undoing. As Victor was placed in handcuffs, his protests turned frantic. He shouted about loyalty, about betrayal, about how no one would believe the story of a woman he claimed had tricked her way into their lives. But his voice was drowned out by the flashes of cameras and the crisp announcement of charges. Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. Years of manipulation are crumbling in minutes. Victoria's collapse was quieter but just as devastating. For decades, she had ruled Chicago's social circles, her influence reaching charity boards and exclusive clubs. Now, she wept openly, mascara streaking as she begged the agents to reconsider. Lauren clung to her mother, terrified of the public ridicule she knew was already waiting online. Ethan remained motionless, a man watching the future he had promised Nia vanish into smoke. And Nia? She stood still, unflinching. The weight of years of insult, exclusion, and doubt lifted in that room. Yet there was no triumph in her face, only resolve. This was never about revenge. It was about justice, about proving that integrity could not be erased by prejudice, that arrogance could not silence truth. Outside, word spread like wildfire. Protesters gathered at the Blake estate before nightfall, their chants echoing against the gates. Online, Lauren's glamorous persona unraveled as thousands mocked her cruelty. Social clubs severed ties with Victoria, politicians distanced themselves from the family, and Victor's arrest became the lead story in every major outlet. But as dramatic as it all was, this was not the end. For Nia, this was only the breaking point, the moment where private pain exploded into public reckoning. The fallout would be long, brutal, and relentless. The courtroom battles, the sentencing, the dismantling of an empire piece by piece. And as the cameras captured the Blakes being led out of their own office in disgrace, one question lingered in the air, heavier than all the others. How could a family so powerful, so untouchable, fall to the very woman they had dismissed as unworthy? The answer was simple, and the world was about to hear it. The courtroom became the stage where the Blake family's empire finally crumbled. For months, hearings unfolded with documents projected on screens, witnesses recounting hidden deals, and regulators outlining every stolen dollar. Each revelation tore another piece from the image of a dynasty once untouchable. When the final sentences were read, over a decade in prison for Victor and Victoria Blake, there was no applause, no gloating. There was only silence, the heavy kind that follows undeniable truth. Lauren Blake, stripped of her assets, declared bankruptcy within weeks. Her carefully curated life of wealth and exclusivity vanished, replaced by headlines mocking her arrogance. Ethan Blake fled Chicago entirely, his name now synonymous with weakness and betrayal. The mansion, once a symbol of their power, was seized, its gates chained, its windows dark. For the city, the scandal was more than news. It was a reckoning. The story of the Blakes was dissected in newspapers, debated on television, and shared endlessly online. But what gripped people most wasn't just the fraud, it was the woman at the center of it. the woman they had mocked, belittled, and dismissed as unworthy. Nia Carter's name became a beacon. No longer introduced as a fiancée or an employee, she was recognized as the investigator who exposed corruption at the highest levels. She stood on stages, honored by state officials for her courage and precision. She accepted awards not with pride, but with quiet dignity, reminding every audience that the battle had never been about money. It had been about truth. And yet, beneath the honors and headlines, the emotional weight lingered. Nia carried scars invisible to cameras. She had endured whispers of gold digger, endured silence when she needed support, and endured the sting of racism from a family that saw her as less than human. What made her victory resonate was not just the takedown of a wealthy empire, but the resilience she embodied in the face of cruelty. In one of her first public addresses after the trial, she stood before a packed room and spoke words that cut deeper than any statistic. They called me unworthy because of my skin and my background. They thought my silence meant weakness. But integrity and intelligence are not measured by wealth or privilege. Her voice carried not only her own story, but the weight of countless others who had been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. Her case became more than a headline, it became a lesson. Training programs for young investigators used her work as a model. Universities cited her case in lectures on ethics and finance. Advocacy groups pointed to her as proof that systemic arrogance, racism, and corruption could be confronted and defeated. But perhaps the greatest impact was the conversations her story ignited. Around dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media, people asked the hard questions. How often are talented Black professionals dismissed or diminished simply because of bias? How many voices are silenced in boardrooms, classrooms, and families because of prejudice masquerading as tradition? And how many empires, like the Blakes, survive on the assumption that no one will dare to challenge them? Nia's victory was not just hers. It was symbolic of a larger truth, that arrogance crumbles in the face of persistence, that racism cannot forever shield corruption, that underestimating someone because of who they are is a gamble that can cost everything. Her story reminds us that behind every smile hiding pain, behind every silence misread as weakness, there may be a storm quietly gathering strength. And when that storm breaks, it doesn't just wash away injustice. It reshapes the ground it touches. So as we reflect on the fall of the Blakes, the question is not just about them. The question is about us. How often do we look away when prejudice shows itself in subtle remarks, in dismissive tones, in whispered judgments? How often do we allow arrogance and privilege to disguise exploitation? And what would change if, like Nia, more people chose not to bow but to rise? Because in the end, this story is not only about corruption. It is about the danger of underestimating those who have been pushed aside. It is about the cost of silence. And it is about the power of truth when carried by someone who refuses to be erased. The Blakes lost their empire, but Nia Carter gained something far greater. She became a symbol of justice, a reminder of resilience, and a voice that cannot be silenced. And the question left for all of us is this: when the next injustice unfolds, will we recognize it, confront it, and stand against it, or will we wait until the storm breaks? What do you think about Nia's journey? Was it just about exposing corruption, or was it about proving something much deeper, that dignity and resilience can outlast arrogance and hate? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If the story moved you, or made you see injustice in a new way, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps us share more stories that deserve to be heard, and together, we can keep these conversations alive.